On the morning after Hogmanay, when the frost still lay thick across the fields of loch and the last of the whisky fumes clung stubbornly to the air, Sergeant Hamish Macbeth was roused not by celebration but by the frantic knocking of young Jamie Maclean, who burst into the station with a face as white as the snow outside. Old Fergus Cameron, the reclusive widower who lived alone at the edge of the village near the Black Loch, had been found dead in his croft house slumped upright in his armchair, the hearth still warm, the door locked from the inside, and no footprints anywhere in the freshly fallen snow but his own. In the Highlands, the first foot after midnight was said to bring luck or ruin depending on who crossed the threshold, and Fergus had been particular about tradition. He had told half the village he expected a tall, dark-haired man to be his first foot for good fortune in the new year. Instead, he had received something far less fortunate. Hamish arrived at the croft with his usual lazy gait, his long legs cutting through the drifts, while his sharp hazel eyes missed nothing. The white expanse around the house was pristine, unbroken except for the path Fergus himself had made earlier that evening when he fetched Pete from the stack. There were no return prints, no sign of struggle outside, and the single door was bolted from within. A small window at the back was latched tight and rimed with frost. Inside, the air was heavy with peat smoke and the lingering scent of spiced whisky. Fergus sat facing the fire, a heavy tartan blanket over his knees, his lined face frozen not in terror, but in mild surprise. On the small table beside him stood 2 glasses, one drained and one untouched. Between them lay a neat sprig of holly tied with red thread, a traditional token, carried by the first foot to ensure prosperity. It was that holly that unsettled Hamish. Fergus had boasted the previous evening at the pub that he had prepared his own holly for the ritual, yet the sprig on the table was not from the bush behind his cottage. Hamish knew that bush well. Its berries were sparse this winter. The sprig before him was lush, its leaves glossy, its berries bright and full. Moreover, it was tied with red thread of a finer sort than Fergus kept in his sewing tin. The detail seemed small, almost foolish to dwell upon when a man lay dead in a locked room, but Hamish had learned long ago that the Highlands hid their secrets in plain sight. Dr. Brodie soon arrived and declared that Fergus had died from a sharp blow to the back of the head, delivered with precision. Yet there was no weapon in sight. No poker out of place, no bloodied ornament, no sign of forced entry. The untouched glass bore a faint smear, as though someone had lifted it and thought better of drinking. Hamish crouched beside the hearth, studying the ash. It had been stirred recently, and beneath the grey powder he glimpsed a darker fragment charred, but not fully consumed. He fished it out carefully with the tongs. It was a scrap of fabric, blackened but unmistakably wool. The villagers gathered outside in anxious knots, their breath clouding the cold air as rumours took shape. Some whispered of curses and ill omens, claiming Fergus must have invited misfortune by boasting too loudly about his New Year's luck. Others insisted a stranger had been seen on the road before midnight, tall and dark-haired, fitting the very description of the ideal first foot. Yet no one admitted to visiting the croft after the bells had rung. The snow told a clear story: no one had approached or left the house between midnight and dawn. Hamish stood in the centre of the small room, hands in his pockets, letting the silence settle. The fire had burned low but steady through the night, suggesting Fergus had not been dead long before being discovered. The second glass implied he had expected company and welcomed it. The holly suggested the visitor had come prepared to honour tradition. And yet the locked door and unmarked snow insisted that whoever had crossed that threshold had vanished into thin air. It was either the simplest of crimes committed by someone Fergus trusted and let in willingly, it was impossibly complex, a deception staged with care and knowledge of Highland customs. As Hamish gazed once more at the bright holly against the gloom of the peat-stained table, he felt the faint stirrings of interest that meant the case was far from unsolvable. In Lochdub, luck and superstition were often blamed for misfortune, but Hamish Macbeth had little faith in either. Someone had first-footed Fergus Cameron that night, and someone had left the croft unseen. The snow might lie, he thought quietly, but people rarely did so without leaving something behind. Hamish remained very still in the croft, allowing the murmurs outside to fade into the background while he replayed the night in his mind, as though he had been present. Fergus had locked his door after returning with Pete. The snow proved that much. He had poured 2 whiskies, set out the holly, and settled himself to await his first foot. He had not been where there were no signs of alarm, no overturned chair, no defensive wounds. The blow had come from behind, delivered by someone who stood close enough to be trusted. And afterward, that someone had managed to leave a bolted door and untouched snow as pristine as a postcard. Constable MacLean hovered awkwardly near the hearth, eager but baffled. "Could he have opened the door after midnight and we just can't see the prints now?" he ventured. Hamish shook his head mildly. "Snow doesn't mend itself, Jamie. Not without wind," and there was none. He crossed to the door and examined the bolt. It was a simple iron slide, stiff with age but functional. No scratches, no splintering, no sign it had been tampered with. Yet as he tested it, he noticed something subtle, a faint smudge along the wood beneath the bolt, as though a hand had steadied itself there. Fergus was right-handed and habitually pushed the bolt across with his palm. The smudge lay lower, angled differently, as if made by someone taller. He turned back to the table and lifted the untouched glass carefully with a handkerchief. The smear on the rim caught the light. It was not the broad print of a man accustomed to farm work, it was narrow, almost delicate. "Did Fergus expect a particular visitor?" Hamish asked casually. "Aye," said Jamie. "He told half the pub head arranged for a proper first foot this year. Said it would set things right after the bad harvest. And who volunteered for the honour?" Jamie hesitated. "No one volunteered exactly, but Mrs. Gallagher joked that her nephew Angus might do. He's tall and dark enough." Hamish gave a non-committal grunt. Angus Gallagher was tall indeed, but broad as a barn door, and hardly delicate with his hands. The glass suggested someone else. Hamish's gaze drifted again to the holly. He lifted it, turning it between his fingers. The red thread was silk, not the coarse cotton sold at Patel's shop in the village. Silk thread in Lochdub was rare enough to be remarked upon. Outside, the villagers parted as Mrs. Gallagher herself approached, wrapped tightly in a wool coat, her cheeks flushed from cold or nerves. "It's a dreadful thing," she declared, though her eyes flicked past Hamish toward the croft's doorway rather than meeting his gaze. "Who'd harm poor Fergus on Hogmanay of all nights?" "Did Angus go first footing?" Hamish asked mildly. She pursed her lips. "He visited friends, same as anyone. But he came home before the bells, I am certain." "Before midnight?" "Yes, well just before." The pause was slight, but Hamish caught it. He had seen sheep hesitate less before stepping into a pen. And did he carry holly? Why would he need to? Fergus had his own. Her answer came too quickly. Hamish nodded as though satisfied, though his mind marked the exchange carefully. He stepped away from the cluster of villagers and circled the cottage once more, studying the small back window. Frost clung thickly to the pane, but along the lower edge, where the frame met the sill, there was a faint irregularity. He brushed it gently with his glove and revealed a nearly invisible line where the frost had melted and refrozen. Not wide enough for a person to climb through, certainly, but wide enough perhaps for something slender to pass. Inside again, he crouched by the hearth and examined the charred scrap of wool more closely. It had once been dark green, not black as first assumed, and woven finely. He rose and glanced at Mrs. Gallagher's coat. It was brown tweed. Angus' jacket, if memory served, was rough grey homespun. Dark green wool, fine quality silk thread, and narrow fingerprint. These details did not sit comfortably with the image of a strapping farm lad trudging through snow. Dr. Brodie cleared his throat. "You've a theory, Hamish?" "Not yet," Hamish replied, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully on the bolt, the glass, and the small refrozen line along the window's edge. "Only a feeling that someone wished us to believe the impossible that a man came through snow without leaving a trace and left by magic. But magic usually requires preparation." As the villagers dispersed under the weight of the cold, and the constable began his routine notes, Hamish stepped once more to the table and examined the red thread against the pale berries. He tugged it gently. It tightened into a neat knot too neat for a casual festive gesture. It was tied with care, with purpose, and as he studied it, he felt the first clear tremor of deception settle into place. Whoever had first-footed Fergus Cameron had done more than bring holly. They had brought a plan, and they had counted on the snow to tell a false story. By late afternoon, the light had begun to fade into that peculiar blue-grey hush that settled over Lochdub in winter, and Hamish made his way from the croft toward the village, the holly sprig now wrapped carefully in paper inside his coat pocket. The snow still lay undisturbed around Fergus Cottage, a silent accomplice to whoever had staged the illusion, and Hamish felt certain the answer lay not in the drifts but in the voices that had already begun reshaping the night to suit themselves. He started at the pub, where Hogmanay stories were being retold with embellishment, and where truth tended to slip out between sips of whiskey. Angus Gallagher was there, as broad and red-faced as ever, his dark hair curling damply at his temples from the heat of the fire. He greeted Hamish with forced cheerfulness, Terrible business about Fergus. I'd have first-footed him myself if I'd known he was alone. You nearly did, by all accounts, Hamish replied mildly, accepting a pint but not drinking. Your aunt mentioned you were about the road near midnight. Angus shrugged. I was out seeing friends. I passed the lane to Fergus Croft before the bells, that's all. Didn't go up. Too cold for wandering about after. His tone was steady, yet he did not quite meet Hamish's eyes. Did you see anyone else on the road? Hamish asked. Why? Morag Sinclair, I think. She was hurrying along with something in her hand. Said she'd forgotten a New Year token. He frowned as though recalling it only now. Funny thing, she'd already been in the pub earlier. Hamish nodded thoughtfully. Morag Sinclair was not tall, but she was slender, with dark hair and a fondness for fine things ordered from Inverness. He left Angus to his drink and found Morag at her small cottage near the harbour, where the wind off the loch carried the scent of salt and peat. She answered quickly, almost as though expecting him. It's dreadful, Hamish, she said, drawing her shawl tighter. Fergus always was particular about tradition. I meant to stop by. Truly, but I thought better of it. You were seen on the road near midnight, Hamish said gently, carrying something. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. Only Holly. ID promised Mrs. Wellington some, but she'd gone home early. I never reached Fergus' place. You didn't? Hamish watched her carefully. You and Fergus had quarrelled over the boundary fence last autumn. That was settled. Her reply was swift, but a faint flush crept up her neck. Besides, what would I gain by harming him? A good deal, perhaps, Hamish said quietly. Fergus planned to contest the land survey again come spring. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the loch behind him. I was home before the bells, she insisted. Ask anyone. I intend to, Hamish replied, and stepped away. As dusk deepened, he called on Mrs. Gallagher once more. This time her hospitality felt strained. Angus was home at 5 minutes to midnight, she declared firmly. I remember because the wireless was counting down. 5 minutes to, Hamish echoed softly. He told me he passed Fergus Lane before the bells, not after. Well, he may have misremembered. She busied herself with the teapot, avoiding his gaze. It was a lively evening. Hamish let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. Did you own a coat of dark green wool, Mrs. Gallagher? Fine weave? Her hand faltered just slightly. No. Why would I? Then, too quickly, Morag has one, though. I've seen her wear it to church. That aligned neatly with the charred scrap from the hearth, yet the eagerness with which she offered it troubled him. Too eager, perhaps, to steer suspicion elsewhere. As he left, he paused by the narrow alley between the cottages. The snow here was trampled from children at play earlier in the day, but beneath the churned surface he noticed a faint groove leading toward the harbourer narrow drag mark, almost erased. Back at the station, Hamish laid out the pieces in his mind. Angus placing Morag on the road Morag, denying she reached the croft, Mrs. Gallagher adjusting Angus' timeline, and the matter of the green wool coat that Morag indeed owned. Each voice carried certainty, yet none aligned perfectly with the others. The contradictions were small, like cracks in ice that might widen under weight. Someone had been out after the bells, someone had carried holly tied with silk thread, and someone had relied on more than luck to vanish from a locked house without leaving footprints. As Hamish stared into the dim glow of the station lamp, he felt the case tightening, the deception no longer broad and theatrical, but narrowing to something precise and deliberate. The next step, he knew, would require more than listening. It would require proving which of those careful voices had rehearsed their story too well. Hamish did not sleep much that night. The wind had risen slightly, brushing fine crystals of snow against the station windows, but not enough to disturb the unmarked stretch around Fergus Croft. By dawn he had already walked the village twice, letting the cold air clear the clutter of half-formed suspicions from his mind. The contradictions he had gathered were like loose threads tugged one too quickly, and the whole weave might distort. What he needed was to understand not only who had lied, but why. Fergus Cameron had not been a beloved man. He had money, or at least more than most in Lochdub believed, and he guarded it closely. He had quarrelled over land boundaries with Morag Sinclair, whose late father's property bordered his own. The survey last autumn had favoured Fergus, shifting a narrow strip of grazing land into his possession. Morag's resentment had been plain enough then, though she had smiled through it. If Fergus intended to press the claim again in spring, she stood to lose more than pride. Yet anger over land did not explain the careful staging of a first-footing ritual, nor the silk thread, nor the calculated absence of footprints. Angus Gallagher presented another strand. Broad-shouldered and good-natured in appearance, He nevertheless carried quiet debts from a failed livestock venture the previous year. Fergus had refused him a loan, publicly and bluntly, in the pub. A humiliation like that could linger. Angus' presence near the croft before midnight placed him within reach, and his aunt's eagerness to secure his alibi hinted at fear. Yet Angus lacked subtlety. The charred scrap of fine green wool did not belong to him, nor did the narrow fingerprint on the glass suggest his heavy hands. If he had struck Fergus, it would have been direct, perhaps even clumsy, not wrapped in tradition and deception. Mrs. Gallagher herself was no innocent bystander in Hamish's mind. She had long prided herself on managing village affairs quietly, guiding outcomes without appearing to do so. Her swift mention of Morag's green coat had been too convenient, almost rehearsed. But what motive would drive her? Fergus had held a small promissory note signed by her late husband, a detail Hamish recalled from idle gossip. If Fergus had intended to collect it in the new year, the debt might have burdened her son as well. Still, the method of the crime suggested someone nimble, someone able to manipulate both ritual and mechanics without drawing attention. And then there was the matter of the holly itself. Silk thread was uncommon in Lochdub, but not impossible to obtain. Morag ordered fine fabrics from Inverness. Mrs. Gallagher had once boasted of a sewing basket inherited from her mother, filled with old trimmings. Even Angus, through his trips to market, might have acquired such a thing. The token could not stand alone as proof. It was part of a tableau designed to imply a traditional first foot, a trusted visitor welcomed gladly. Hamish returned to Fergus Croft once more, this time alone, and stood again before the small back window. The faint refrozen line along its edge troubled him more than any alibi. Someone had opened it briefly during the night. Not wide enough to admit a body, but wide enough for a tula for a length of cord. His gaze drifted to the iron bolt on the door. If one could fasten a cord to the bolt before stepping outside, close the door, and then draw the bolt into place through a narrow opening, the idea lingered, incomplete, but plausible. That would explain the untouched snow. The killer had left before the door was bolted, then secured it from outside. But such preparation required forethought and knowledge of Fergus' habits. The visitor must have known he would sit by the fire, that he would expect a first foot, that he would bolt the door after his guest departed. Or perhaps the guest had never departed at all until Fergus lay dead. The two glasses suggested conversation, a shared moment. No sign of struggle indicated trust. The blow had been delivered from behind after Fergus had turned back to his fire, perhaps believing his guest gone. Fear now entered the maze. If Fergus intended to expose someone in the new year over land, debt, or something more personal, that person might have seen Hogmanay as a final opportunity. Jealousy, too, could not be dismissed. Rumours had once linked Fergus and Morag in younger days, before bitterness hardened them. Old entanglements could be as sharp as new grievances. By the time Hamish stepped back into the pale morning light, the web of motives felt less chaotic and more deliberate. Each suspect possessed a reason, yet only one would combine motive with the patience to stage a lock-troom illusion. The drag mark near the harbour, the silk thread, the green wool, the shifting alabizal were strands of the same net, and somewhere within that net, one voice had spoken too carefully, too precisely, to avoid the truth. The breakthrough came just after noon, when Constable Maclean burst into the station with the sort of breathless triumph that usually preceded disappointment. In his hand he carried a length of thin fishing line, stiff with cold, and tied at one end was a short strand of red silk thread. "Found it by the harbour steps," he announced. "Caught under the ice along that drag mark you noticed, and look same silk as the holly." Hamish took it carefully. The thread matched perfectly in colour and sheen. The line itself was fine but strong, the sort used for sea trout along the loch. If looped through the iron bolt and drawn tight from outside through the narrow gap of the back window, it could indeed have slid the bolt into place after the killer stepped out and closed the door. The theory he had only half formed now stood solidly before him. The lock-troom mystery was no magic at all, it was method. "Whose line is it?" Hamish asked quietly. "Morag Sinclair's," Jamie replied at once. "She fishes off the harbour rocks. I checked her shed, there's a spool missing, and the cut end matches this." His eyes shone with certainty. "And she owns that green coat. I saw it hanging by her door." Within the hour, word had spread. Morag was brought in, pale but composed, her dark hair pinned neatly as ever. When confronted with the fishing line, her composure flickered. "Lots of folk fish," she said. "You can't prove that's mine." "The silk thread," Jamie pressed, laying the holly sprig beside it. "You use silk in your sewing. Mrs. Gallagher saw you on the road. Angus placed you near the croft. The net tightened swiftly, perhaps too swiftly. Morag's alibi wavered under the weight of specifics. She admitted she had walked toward Fergus Lane after midnight, intending to deliver Holly and mend their quarrel before the new year began. She claimed she had lost her nerve and turned back, yet the fishing line, the green wool scrap from the hearth, and her shifting timeline painted a damning picture. By late afternoon she was formally charged, the village murmuring with grim satisfaction at the neatness of it all. Hamish watched the proceedings with a quiet detachment that unsettled Jamie. The evidence aligned cleanly. Motive over land, opportunity near midnight, means to manipulate the bolt, and materials linking her to the scene. Even the charred scrap of green wool could be explained, perhaps singed, as she leaned too close to the hearth while Fergus' back was turned. It was elegant in its completeness. Too elegant. That evening, as Morag sat in the small holding cell, insisting on her innocence with a steadiness that bordered on resignation, Hamish returned once more to Fergus Croft. The snow had begun to crust over, preserving the original prints like fossils. He stood by the hearth and imagined Morag there, slender, tense, calculating the placement of the fishing line, striking Fergus, then calmly setting the Holly between the glasses before slipping out to secure the bolt. It was possible, yet something in the sequence jarred. He knelt again by the hearth and sifted the ash where he had found the wool fragment. The burn pattern was uneven, as though the fabric had been pushed deliberately into the embers rather than caught accidentally. A careful destruction, not a careless singe. If Morag had worn the coat during the crime, why attempt to burn a scrap at the scene instead of disposing of the garment entirely? And why leave the rest intact at home? His gaze shifted to the 2 whiskey glasses. Fergus was drained, the other untouched. If Morag had intended reconciliation, would she not have taken at least a polite sip? The smear on the rim had been faint, almost hesitant. It suggested someone who lifted the glass briefly perhaps to create the impression of shared drink, then set it down untouched. Outside, a faint movement caught his eye. Across the field, near the edge of the road, a tall figure paused before continuing toward the village. Angus Gallagher, even at a distance. Hamish could see the man's broad shoulders stiff against the cold. He watched him until he disappeared beyond the bend. Back at the station, Jamie was already drafting the report, buoyed by the clarity of the case. "Open and shut, sir," he said with relief. Clever trick with the line, but she slipped. "Aye," Hamish murmured, though his eyes remained on the small paper-wrapped holly sprig on his desk. Open and shut cases rarely required so much careful staging. And criminals who believed themselves clever enough to design a lock-troom illusions seldom left behind such obvious threads unless they wished them to be found. Morag sat silent in her cell, while outside the winter night thickened over Lockdub. The village believed the matter settled, the deception exposed. Yet Hamish felt the faintest tightening in his chest, the same instinct that had stirred at the sight of silk thread against bright berries. Somewhere within the apparent victory, a detail remained misaligned. And if Morag Sinclair was not the architect of the deception, then the true planner had just succeeded in placing the blame exactly where it would be most readily accepted. Hamish remained at his desk long after Jamie had gone home, the station quiet save for the occasional crack of frost shifting along the roof. Morag's steady insistence on her innocence echoed in his mind, not hysterical, not indignant, but weary as though she had stepped into a trap she had half expected. He unwrapped the holly once more, and studied the silk thread under the lamplight. It was not merely red, it held a faint gold strand woven through it, almost invisible, unless the light struck at the right angle. He had seen thread like that before, though not recently. He rose abruptly and crossed to the old filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers stiff with age. From the back he withdrew a thin folder, yellowed at the edges. 5 years earlier, there had been a quiet scandal in Lochdub involving missing funds from the Harbour Improvement Committee. The matter had never reached court, the money had been repaid discreetly, and the incident allowed to fade. 2 names had appeared in the inquiry: Fergus Cameron, who had chaired the committee, and Angus Gallagher, then newly ambitious and eager to prove himself. The investigation had concluded that accounting errors were to blame. Yet Hamish remembered the tension between them, afterward an undercurrent that had never quite dissipated. He flipped through the statements until another detail surfaced. The committee's treasurer at the time had been Mrs. Gallagher. She had kept meticulous sewing ledgers alongside financial notes, and Hamish distinctly recalled her pride in a box of silk embroidery threads inherited from her mother fine silk, red with a glint of gold, ordered years ago from Inverness for decorative work on ceremonial banners. The thread in his hand shimmered faintly. A slow understanding began to form, reaching backward through years of quiet grievances. If funds had indeed gone missing, Fergus might have known more than he admitted. Perhaps he had covered for someone. Perhaps he had threatened in recent weeks to revisit the matter. The new year was often a time for settling old scores. If Angus still carried debt from his failed venture, and if Mrs. Gallagher feared renewed scrutiny of past accounts, Fergus' intention to contest land boundaries or call in promissory notes might have been only part of the pressure. The past could tighten around a family like frost around roots. But where did Morag fit into this older pattern? Hamish considered her carefully. Her father had served briefly on the same harbour committee before his death. There had been whispers then, to nothing proven, but enough to sour relations. If Fergus had manipulated those accounts years ago to his own advantage, Morag's resentment over the boundary dispute might have been layered atop older suspicion. Yet resentment did not equal guilt. Another overlooked detail surfaced in his memory. During the earlier inquiry, it had been Angus who discovered the supposed accounting error, bringing it to Fergus privately before it reached the full committee. That act had earned him public gratitude-earned quiet leverage. If Angus and his mother had reason to fear Fergus reopening that past, they would also know precisely how methodical he could be. Hamish closed the file slowly. The silk thread no longer seemed an incidental flourish, it felt personal, almost careless in its familiarity. If Mrs. Gallagher had indeed used her old embroidery silk to tie the holly, she might not have realised how distinctive it was. Morag's fishing line could have been taken easily from her shed she lived alone, her tools left in plain sight, a spool removed, a length cut, and planted where Hamish would be certain to find it along the drag mark. The drag mark itself took on new meaning, not the mark of a body or heavy object, but of someone pulling a line taut across crusted snow, while keeping to an already disturbed path near the harbour, where footprints would go unnoticed. Angus, broad and strong, would manage such manoeuvring easily. Mrs. Gallagher, careful and observant, would ensure the alibis aligned just enough to withstand casual scrutiny. Hamish leaned back, the pieces shifting into a darker alignment. The crime was not born solely of land disputes or holiday quarrels. It was the culmination of years of quiet compromise and mutual secrets off debts covered, pride wounded, and fear of exposure. Fergus Cameron had held knowledge that could unravel more than a boundary line. And someone who had once trusted him enough to share responsibility had decided that the new year would bring silence instead of reckoning. In the cell, Morag sat unaware of the deeper currents moving beyond her accusation. Outside, the night thickened again over Loch, but for Hamish the shadows now stretched further than Hogmanay. They reached back through years of polite smiles and sealed ledgers, and somewhere within that history lay the true architect of the first-footing deception. Hamish returned to the station the next morning, his mind still circling the threads of the past, present, and the half-truths layered among them. Morag sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes alert but guarded. Hamish poured himself a cup of tea, letting the steam rise before he addressed her, not as an interrogator but as someone who preferred to observe the unguarded spaces between words. "Morag," he began, voice calm, "I want you to think back to last night at Fergus Croft. I don't need a story, just a simple recollection. Tell me what you saw when you arrived. Nothing more than that." She blinked, uncertain, then spoke slowly, describing the moonlight on the snow, the frost on the windows, the low glow of the peat fire. Hamish nodded occasionally, encouraging, letting her supply the visual details while he remained silent, as though absorbing her account rather than pressing her for proof. When she finished, he leaned back, fingers tapping the table. "You described the glow of the fire," he said casually. "Do you recall if the second glass was upright or had it been tipped in any way?" She hesitated, frowning. It stood upright. I didn't touch it. I barely noticed it." Hamish smiled faintly as though considering her words. "Imagine for a moment you were Fergus, and someone you trusted stepped inside. You would have offered a drink, yes? You might even lift a glass to theirs and sip together." He paused, letting the thought hang in the room. "You did not take a sip yourself. That is curious. Why would someone lift a glass but not drink?" Her hands tightened instinctively. She shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing slightly. "The second don't know," she murmured. "Perhaps I forgot. Perhaps I was nervous. Or perhaps someone had been there before you and wished to suggest your presence," Hamish said softly, letting the words drift like smoke. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If I told you the holly, the silk thread, and even the wool fragment were intended to be noticed, what would you say?" Her breath caught. A slight tremor passed over her fingers as she looked down. "Intended to be noticed?" she repeated, voice barely audible. Hamish waited. Silence stretched thin between them. Yes, some people like to leave breadcrumbs, thinking the discovery is inevitable, but sometimes those breadcrumbs point to someone else. Her eyes flicked up suddenly, a sharp motion that betrayed more than words could. Hamish noticed its almost imperceptible glance toward the clock, toward the door, a flicker of fear. A crack, just a crack, but enough to suggest that her composure was not as complete as she pretended. "Morag," he said gently, "it's not anger I want, nor confession on impulse, just honesty. Did anyone instruct you to leave anything behind? Any silk? Any holly? Anything meant to mislead?" Her lips pressed tightly together. For a heartbeat, Hamish thought she would say nothing. Then the colour drained from her face as she whispered, I didn't do anything like that, I swear." But the voice lacked conviction, the clarity that usually accompanied truth. The crack widened ever so slightly in the otherwise steady facade she had maintained. Hamish leaned back, tapping the table thoughtfully. He did not accuse, he did not press further. The clue had been unconventional, psychological rather than physical, an appeal to perception, to memory, to instinct. And it had worked. While Morag's words remained innocent on the surface, her reactions, the subtle hesitation, the involuntary glance, the tension in her finger spoke volumes. Someone had manipulated her, or she had been placed at the centre of a deception she had not yet fully understood. Outside, the winter wind rattled the panes. Hamish sipped his tea slowly, eyes on the suspect but mind on the larger picture. The locked door, the untouched snow, the carefully placed holothy were all still there, their meanings shifting slightly in the light of this new insight. The real orchestrator had remained in the shadows, watching, waiting, and for the first time, Hamish felt that the puzzle was beginning to tilt, the faintest slope revealing the path toward the truth. Hamish awoke the next morning to a sharp chill that crept through the station's thin windows, and before he could even consider tea, Jamie McLean was at his side, looking pale and flustered. "Sir," he gasped, holding a folded piece of paper. "The scrap from the hearth, it's gone. Someone's taken it." Hamish's brow furrowed. He took the paper from Jamie, only to find the small charred fragment of green wool missing. Where it had been carefully bagged and labelled, there was now a faint smear of soot on the envelope, the result of something being lifted, removed, or replaced. "Vanished?" he asked quietly. "Aye," Jamie said, wringing his hands. "I checked the evidence locker. No one else had access, but the bag's empty. It's as if it was never there." Hamish walked slowly to the window, staring out at the frozen loch, tracing the line of the harbour in the distance. Someone had been watching not just Morag, not just Angus, but a third hand, one patient enough to wait until the right moment. The scrap had been key, a small, tangible link between Morag, the wool, and the charred spot in the hearth that tied her to the scene. Without it, the narrative risked collapse. Whoever had taken it understood its significance, and understood Hamish's investigative habits well enough to predict when he would consult it. He moved deliberately back to the desk and spread out the remaining clues. The silk-threaded holly, the fishing line found along the drag mark, the 2 glasses, and the faint smudge along the door bolt. Each of them now carried added weight, but none could confirm the sequence the scrap had hinted at. He thought carefully, retracing the steps of his recent psychological probe with Morag. She had reacted subtly, but the charred wool fragment had reinforced the suspicion that someone else had manipulated Hero or worse, used her as a pawn. Now, that physical confirmation was gone. "Do you think it could be someone in the station?" Jamie asked, eyes wide. "Someone trying to quiet Jamie," Hamish said softly, his voice even but sharp. "This isn't about panic. It's about control. Whoever removed it wanted to unsettle us, and they've succeeded partially. But the scrap wasn't the only thread." He returned to the holly, examining the silk and the tiny glint of gold thread. That piece could not be altered without destroying it, and its provenance remained distinct. He picked up the fishing line, noting again its perfect placement in the harbour snow, where only someone familiar with the shoreline could have positioned it so carefully. The physical disappearance of one fragment did not erase the patterns left behind by intent and method. Hamish walked to the evidence cabinet once more, opening drawers and carefully scanning for anything else that might have been tampered with. Nothing else had moved. Someone had been selective surgical even. That suggested they were confident, comfortable enough in the village's small rhythms to strike without drawing suspicion. Trust, Hamish realised, was no longer a given. Anyone could now be a conduit for misdirection. He returned to the window and studied the village. The snow had begun to thaw slightly under the weak morning sun, erasing subtle prints that might have been traced back to the thief. The harbour, quiet and glinting, held secrets as clearly as the frozen loch beyond. Hamish knew that the missing scrap meant more than inconvenience, it was a warning. Someone was actively working against him, aware of the momentum he was building toward uncovering the true killer. The act was deliberate, bold and chilling in its precision. Hamish finally sat back at his desk, his hands steepled under his chin. The stakes had risen. The threads of past and present, of silk, wool and footprints, were still there, but the absence of the crucial fragment now made it a more delicate puzzle. Whoever was behind Fergus Cameron's death was not finished, and each misstep Hamish took could be used against him. The shadows had grown longer, the game more intricate, and Tristance, a small comforter, had become the rarest commodity of all. The afternoon sun had barely pierced the low-hanging clouds when Hamish stepped outside, intending to visit the croft once more, retracing the paths that the snow still preserved. He had barely crossed the village square when a scream tore through the air, sharp and unexpected, cutting across the calm hush of midwinter lochdub. It was a sound that made him pivot instinctively, heart hammering. From the direction of the harbour, voices shouted in alarm. Hamish ran, the snow crouching beneath his boots, and found Constable MacLean leaning over the side of a narrow alleyway, his face pale and shaken. "It's Angus," Jamie gasped. He's gone. The boat shed. Someone attacked him." Hamish followed to the small boathouse that jutted over the frozen loch, doors swinging from their hinges. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Splintered wood, overturned crates, and a single boot pressed into the frost outside the doorway. Angus was nowhere to be seen, blood-streaked. The snow at the threshold, but not enough to suggest a mortal wound. Whoever had struck him had moved quickly, with purpose and skill, and then vanished as cleanly as they had at Fergus Croft. Hamish's mind raced. The first attack had been methodical, precise, and designed to mislead. Now, the second incident revealed something new. The perpetrator was emboldened, daring to strike again so soon after the initial crime, and within sight of witnesses. Their confidence suggested intimate knowledge of both the village's rhythms and his own movements. Whoever they were, they had not counted on Hamish's attention to detail his instincts. Jamie pointed to a fragment of green wool snagged on a splintered plank. Hamish knelt and examined it closely. It was charred, matching the piece that had gone missing from the station. Whoever had taken the scrap had left a deliberate trace here, a breadcrumb for the observant eye. It was not a mistake, it was a message, perhaps a taunt. Hamish ran his hand along the edge of the broken door and noted the faint glimmer of red thread intertwined with the green wool. Silk, the same silk thread from the holly. His eyes narrowed. The same hand, or at least someone with access to the same materials was orchestrating both incidents. The psychological manipulation, the carefully staged evidence, the removal of key fragments. It all pointed to a mind several steps ahead, calculating, patient and audacious. He turned to Jamie. The first attack was to create a false solution, the missing scrap to mislead us. This one is to escalate, to pressure us into a misstep. Whoever is behind this knows we're close, but they want to control the pace. "Do you think Angus will be found?" Jamie asked nervously. "Alive, I hope," Hamish said grimly. "And that hope is all the leverage we have right now." He scanned the area around the boathouse, noting footprints that had not been there when he and Jamie arrived, faint impressions half melted in the snow, suggesting someone had carried or dragged a body, at least faked such an impression. The level of deception was surgical. As Hamish studied the scene, a shadow moved along the opposite bank of the loch. He stiffened, catching the glint of someone crouching among the reeds, watching. The figure vanished before he could identify it, but the message was unmistakable. The orchestrator was still active, still observing, and still several steps ahead. The cosy rhythms of the village were shattered. Hamish felt the chill deep in his bone snot just from the wind off the loch, but from the realization that this was no longer a single crime to solve. The perpetrator was escalating, daring him to follow, manipulating evidence, creating fear, and controlling perception. Every misdirection, every stolen fragment, every subtle psychological nudge had been calculated to mislead him and the authorities alike. The stakes had risen beyond accusation. Now it was a matter of preventing another act, protecting lives, and unmasking someone whose patience and cunning made them almost untouchable. He straightened, voice low but firm. "Jamie, gather the men quietly. We watch. No one goes home. Whoever planned this, they think they are invisible, but everyone leaves a mark eventually." As the wind swept across the frozen loch, Hamish felt it keenly. The hunt had shifted. The villain was no longer a puzzle of the past, they were a predator in the present, and Hamish Macbeth had only begun to glimpse the depths of their cunning. Hamish spent the next few hours combing the harbour, revisiting the paths, the snowbanks, and the boathouse with meticulous care. Every detail he had noted: faint drag marks in the snow, the glimmer of red silk thread, the charred fragment of green wool. The positioning of the hollow circulated in his mind like puzzle pieces laid out on a table, jumbled but awaiting orientation. He walked slowly along the edge of the loch, eyes scanning not just footprints but small irregularities in the frozen surface, the spacing of snow-laden reeds, and the faint impressions left by objects that had been moved or carried. Each observation reminded him that the perpetrator was precise, controlled, and deliberate, yet one pattern had eluded him until now. It was a comment Morag had made days earlier that came back sharply. She had described the glow of Fergus' fire, and noted almost casually, he always liked his hearth stirred before settling in, said it helped the peat burn evenly. At the time, Hamish had filed it away as a quaint habit of the deceased, nothing more. Now, in the context of the charred scrap and the placement of the second glass, it clicked. The hearth was never meant to conceal or destroy evidence accidentally. The fire had been a stage, not just a detail. Whoever had struck Fergus had understood this habit and exploited it, creating a traceable yet misleading artifact in the asher fragment, meant to be discovered, leading investigators down a path of false certainty. Hamish crouched beside the edge of the boathouse again, examining the splintered wood and the tiny snag of green wool caught along it. The line was not just a clue, it was part of a repeated method. Both incidents, Fergus' death and the attack on Angoshad, involved elements placed to suggest one thing while hiding another. The silk thread, the drag marks, the placement of objects were all signals meant to shape perception, to mislead. Yet the signals had been subtle, repetitive, and patterned. The perpetrator had relied on predictability, predictable reactions, predictable assumptions, predictable behaviours. He stood and looked across the village, thinking about the interactions he had observed. Mrs. Gallagher's too eager redirection of suspicion, Angus' careful accounts of his movements, Morag's precise recollections each had contained small, seemingly insignificant cues. One line of dialogue, one gesture, one habitual movement had been ignored until viewed together. He realised that the key was not just in the physical evidence, but in the human patterns, how the suspects allowed themselves to be framed, and how the perpetrator relied on those habits to shape the narrative. A sudden clarity struck him when he recalled the silk thread in the holly. It was not only distinctive in colour and texture, it was woven in a pattern that mirrored the embroidery Mrs. Gallagher favoured, a technique she had taught Morag when the girl was younger. The same hand, or at least someone trained by that hand, had been involved in preparing the deceptive first-footing scene. That explained the gold glint in the silk, the careful tying of the holly, and the staged evidence left for discovery. The connection between the harbour attack, the missing scrap, and the original crime crystallised. Someone intimately familiar with both the village's habits and the individuals involved had orchestrated events, counting on everyone's predictable assumptions. Hamish leaned against the railing of the boathouse and let the realisation settle. The pattern had been in plain sight all along: small domestic habits, minor interactions, and repeated gestures that no one else had considered noteworthy. The true perpetrator had depended on underestimating the weight of such details, assuming that investigators would follow the obvious threads without questioning the subtle consistencies woven through the village and its people. He smiled faintly, a slow tightening of focus. The chaos, the misdirections, and the stolen evidence were not random, they were all part of a carefully constructed pattern. And now, finally, Hamish Macbeth could see the shape of it clearly. The first-footing deception was not merely a clever illusion, it was a signature, and it had led him directly to the mind behind it. Hamish returned to Fergus Cameron's croft under the thin light of a late afternoon sky, the chill biting through his coat, his mind still circling the clarity he had gained from the emerging pattern. He moved carefully inside, noting the hearth, the position of the holly, the faint smudges on the floorboards, all under the same watchful eye that had traced them before. Each familiar object now carried a new significance. The silk thread, the green wool, the drag marks were not just evidence. They were intentional markers of a mind orchestrating chaos to satisfy some deeper need. Hamish's thoughts settled on the psychological side of the crime, the impulse behind it, which had been concealed behind layers of misdirection and old grudges. He reflected on the villagers' statements, the contradictions, the eagerness of some, and the restraint of others. Nothing he had observed pointed solely to greed or petty revenge. The staged evidence, the careful removal of incriminating fragments, the manipulation of Morag into the role of the false culprit thieves were the hallmarks of someone who took a meticulous pleasure in control, not just over events but over perception, over belief itself. And then it struck him. The obsession ran deeper than simple quarrels over land or debt. Fergus had been privy to secrets so intimate and potentially humiliating that exposure would shatter long-standing relationships. Secrets so delicate that their revelation could only be contained through total, calculated domination. He recalled the scrap of green wool, charred and removed, and the placement of the holly on the table. The perpetrator had wanted to lead Hamish and anyone observing Ginto thinking the solution lay with Morag, or perhaps Angus, to frame the scene, to direct suspicion while the real motivator remained hidden. It was not merely a question of opportunity or advantage, it was about correcting a narrative, shaping the outcome according to the villain's will. The crimes were acts of precision, almost artistic, designed to exert absolute influence over the story as it unfolded. Hamish's thoughts turned to Mrs. Gallagher. The gold-threaded silk, her teachings to Morag years earlier, the subtle hints of domestic influence Sethi pointed toward her. She had the knowledge, the skill, and the patience to plan such a deception. But why the extremity of violence? He considered her past, the old harbour committee, the missing funds quietly resolved, the dormant threats, the slow accumulation of resentment and fear. Fergus had threatened to expose irregularities in the accounts again, though harmless to most, enough to implicate her son and perhaps her reputation. Yet the elaborate nature of the staged evidence and the attack on Angus suggested something beyond protection of money or pride. It came to him like the first crack of winter sun through mist. It was about control over morality itself. Mrs. Gallagher had spent years maintaining order, shaping the village in her mind according to rules of propriety, tradition, and secrecy. Fergus' intention's willingness to revisit old claims, to assert knowledge and influence represented chaos, unpredictability, the potential unravelling of carefully held order. The first-footing murder, the manipulated evidence, the attack on Angazor were manifestations of her desire to control not just outcomes, but the narrative, to impose a moral equilibrium through terror and precision. Hamish pictured her moving through the village, calm and courteous, the grandmotherly figure concealing the intensity of her calculations. She had not acted in haste. Each action had been considered, rehearsed, and executed with the confidence that her knowledge of the villagers' habits would shield her from suspicion. The silk thread, the drag marks, the staged holly, the removed scray patch element reflected not greed, not vengeance, but the satisfaction of constructing a world on her own meticulous terms. Fergus and anyone else who threatened that order were not merely obstacles, they were challenges to be neutralised. Hamish's lips pressed into a thin line. The revelation was more chilling than any monetary or land dispute. The motive was ideology filtered through obsession. The crimes were extreme because the stakes, in her mind, were existential control over her environment, over the narrative of right and wrong, over the perception of every individual she had ever guided or influenced. She had killed not for gain, not for pride, but to preserve the universe she had built in her own mind. And the lengths she had gone to, the artistry of the deception, confirmed she was willing to cross any boundary to protect that fragile construct. Hamish spent the evening preparing carefully, moving with deliberate precision through the small station. Every scrap of evidence, every observation, every behavioural quirk had now coalesced into a clear picture of the orchestrator. Morag had been an unwitting pawn, Angus a convenient red herring, and Mrs. Gallagher, the seemingly benign matron of Loch was the mind behind the first-footing deception. The silk, the drag marks, the removed wool, the staged holithy all led back to her, and Hamish knew that confronting her directly was the only way to unmask the full truth. He waited until the village fell into that near silence of night, when only the wind and the faint barking of distant dogs disturbed the snow-covered streets. Mrs. Gallagher, as predicted, had left her cottage, ostensibly to check on the candles in the harbour. Hamish followed quietly, keeping to the shadows, observing her careful, deliberate steps. Every motion, every glance was consistent with a woman used to controlling how she was perceived. He allowed her to reach the narrow lane by the harbour before stepping into her path. "Evening, Mrs. Gallagher," he said quietly, voice calm, measured. She started but recovered instantly, folding her hands as though he were merely a curious neighbour. "Hamish," she said smoothly, voice warm, unaffected. What a surprise at this hour. "Something troubling you?" Not troubling precisely, he replied, matching her calm. Curious, perhaps. I've been thinking about Fergus, the first footing, and the peculiar circumstances surrounding both that night and the attack on Angus. He let the words settle, observing her reaction closely. A flicker barely perceptible crossed her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation. Do you mean to suggest there's more to it than we've already considered? She asked softly, tilting her head. I do, Hamish said. You've been careful, Mrs. Gallagher. Too careful. The silk thread, the holly, the charred fragment of wool you left breadcrumbs. You removed key evidence when you realised it might reveal more than you intended. And then the second incident at the boathouse 8 wasn't just misdirection. It was a pattern perfectly consistent with someone intimately familiar with the habits, weaknesses, and expectations of everyone involved. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She took a step back, glancing at the shadows behind the station, perhaps considering flight, though Hamish had anticipated it. Why, Hamish? She asked, voice steady but with a trace of sharpness. Why go to all this trouble for Fergus Cameron? He met her gaze evenly. Because in your mind it wasn't just him. It was control over the story, over the village, over anyone who might challenge the order you've maintained for decades. You couldn't allow Fergus or anyone else to upset the balance you've built. And you believed correctly that no one would look past the surface, no one would see the small patterns, the repeated gestures, the breadcrumbs you left behind. Except me. Her hands shook slightly now, betraying the composure she had maintained all evening. I only wanted to protect them, she whispered almost to herself. To protect the village the way it should be. The order. Hamish nodded slowly, taking a careful step closer. Protecting what is not yours to govern does not absolve murder, Mrs. Gallagher. Fergus and Angus, innocent or guilty of minor transgressions, were not the arbiters of morality you were, and that made you dangerous. For a moment she looked as though she might collapse. Then she stiffened. Her eyes darted to the snow behind her, calculating escape, but the narrow lane, the frozen harbour, and Hamish's unwavering presence offered no real opportunity. She took a step back, then another, and finally sank into the snow-laden bank, hands lifted in reluctant surrender. I suppose, she said quietly, voice almost brittle, that the pattern was always going to give me away. Hamish kept his voice calm, guiding her gently toward the waiting constables. Patterns are what we see when the chaos of human behaviour is observed closely. You relied on misdirection, on fear, on predictable reactions. But when someone notices the details you cannot control, the illusion collapses. It's over now. As the constables led her away, Hamish looked out over the frozen loch, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The case that had seemed impossibly complex, full of misleading clues and vanished evidence, had finally resolved. Mrs. Gallagher's psychological obsession had driven her to extremes, but the careful attention to detail, the patience to observe patterns, and the ability to read subtle human behaviour had brought her to light. The first-footing deception, elegant and meticulous, had been unmasked, and Hamish Macbeth, as always, had seen what others could not. The village seemed to exhale in relief the following morning. The snow, disturbed by hurried footsteps and the boathouse struggle, had begun to crust over again, and the streets of Loch carried the quiet hush of a community believing the danger was past. Hamish had returned to the station, checking and rechecking the evidence, filing reports, and watching Morag and Angus regain a tentative composure. The first-footing deception had been Salvador, so everyone thought. Yet, as he sorted the notes once more, a small detail tugged at him. The red silk thread with its faint gold glint, now stored in evidence, seemed different somehow. He traced the strand carefully with his fingers and frowned. The gold was woven in a slightly irregular pattern, one not consistent with Mrs. Gallagher's habitual embroidery. He recalled the old lessons she had taught Morag: precise, meticulous loops, uniform tension, flawless execution. This strand wavered slightly, suggesting a hand that had been trained. Yes, but not hers. Hamish's mind raced. He reviewed everything. The drag marks, the holly, the wool fragment, the boathouse attack, Mrs. Gallagher's confession, her motivation rooted in control. It all pointed to her, but this thread, the irregularity, was a whisper that something had been overlooked. He remembered the subtle detail in Morag's account the night of the first attack. She had seen a shadow behind the hedge, near the road, the same night Hamish had noticed Angus lingering near the croft, a figure slipping silently across the frozen loch. At the time it had seemed incidental, or perhaps misremembered in panic. He re-examined Morag's and Angus's timelines, comparing them with footprints in the fresh snow, and a chilling realization dawned. There was a sequence no one had noticed between the croft and the boathouse. A path of evidence suggested intervention by a third-party Somione who had orchestrated certain misdirections, planting items, manipulating perceptions, and then withdrawing entirely from view. Someone who had ensured that Mrs. Gallagher, with her obsessive control, would take the blame. Hamish felt a cold spark of excitement. The real mastermind had been hidden in plain sight, relying on the perfect scapegoat to be identified first, manipulating Mrs. Gallagher's psychology to ensure her confession while remaining anonymous. He knew the signature: careful observation, precise timing, reliance on human predictability, and there was only one person in Lochdub whose habits, access, and ingenuity could match such a scheme. He moved swiftly, retracing the path to the harbour, the snow crunching beneath his boots, eyes scanning for the faintest traces. There, at the edge of the frozen water, he spotted it, a tiny indentation in the ice, the subtle mark of someone having crouched and observed, perhaps even planted the silk thread deliberately to draw him toward Mrs. Gallagher. Hamish knelt, tracing the impression, and allowed his mind to connect the threads. The orchestrator had remained several steps ahead, manipulating not only Mrs. Gallagher, but the entire investigation, choosing what to reveal and what to conceal. He turned toward the village, recalling casual remarks, unexpected errands, and small errands that had seemed insignificant. Deliveries Morag had made at odd hours, packages Angus had carried without mention, the presence of a quiet, almost invisible figure who always seemed one step behind the events, yet perfectly positioned to observe them. The full scale of the deception emerged. Mrs. Gallagher had been an instrument, not the author, the brilliant but shadowed mind waiting, unseen, to see the chaos unfold before finally claiming credit through omission. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of the hunt sharpen, this final twist the true mastermind lurking, manipulating events, and trusting no one would notice was the test he had been preparing for. The first-footing deception had been solved, the confessed culprit exposed, but now the real game had begun, unmasking the shadow who had played both detective and deceived with the same invisible hand. The village's quiet certainty had been shattered, the true architect remained at large, and Hamish Macbeth was the only one with the patience, perception, and precision to bring them into the light. Hamish spent the remainder of the morning quietly assembling the pieces, tracing each thread of the deception back to its true origin. By midday, he had compiled a sequence that left little room for doubt. Mrs. Gallagher had acted out of obsessive control, yes, but she had been guided, nudged, and ultimately manipulated by someone far more calculating, someone who understood the rhythms of Lochdub and the predictable impulses of its residents. The silk thread with its subtle irregularity, the carefully staged drag marks, the missing wool fragmental were part of a deliberate choreography, designed to mislead not only the villagers but the authorities themselves. He returned to the croft, this time with the patience to watch, to wait for the shadow he now knew existed. Hours passed, and the late winter sun dropped low, casting long, pale reflections across the frozen loch. Then, just as he suspected, movement stirred among the reeds at the far edge of the harbour. A figure, slight and deliberate, attempting to remain unseen. Hamish approached cautiously, voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we spoke." The figure froze, then stepped into the thin light, revealing a face both familiar and unsettling. Angus' neighbour, Mr. Callum Fraser, the quiet accountant who had always appeared diligent and inconspicuous, but whose knowledge of both financial minutiae and the villagers' routines had allowed him to orchestrate events from behind the scenes. Callum's eyes widened, and for a moment he considered fleeing. Hamish's steady presence, however, and the realization that every move had been tracked, left him with no avenue. "I should have known," Hamish said softly, as much to himself as to the man before him. "Every subtle habit, every misdirected clue, every carefully placed item, it all leads back to you. You relied on Mrs. Gallagher to act according to your design, expecting the chaos to conceal your own hand." Callum's shoulders slumped, the first sign of genuine uncertainty he had shown. "I didn't mean... I just wanted to protect the balance," he murmured. "I had to make sure that no one else got hurt." Hamish tilted his head, considering him. "You speak of protection, yet your actions nearly led to 2 deaths. Fergus, the first attack, the boathouse incident, they were all consequences of your manipulations. You controlled perception, but you lost control of events. That is why I was able to see the pattern the irregularity in the silk thread, the timing of movements, and the subtle traces left in the snow all betrayed your presence." Callum's lips parted, perhaps in protest, perhaps in fear, but he offered no argument. The constables, previously stationed discreetly nearby under Hamish's direction, moved forward to secure him. He did not resist, realizing at last that the web he had woven could not withstand the patient observation of the village detective. Hamish stepped back, watching the man escorted toward the station. The pieces now fit together: the obsessive precision of Mrs. Gallagher, the orchestrated misdirections, the vanished evidence, the psychological manipulation, all had been elements of Callum Fraser's plan to control both the outcomes and the narrative. Justice, in the form of exposure and arrest, had been delivered at last. Yet, as he looked across the frozen loch and the quiet streets of Loch, Hamish felt a familiar, lingering unease. The mastermind had been caught, but the subtle traces of human folly, misdirection, and hidden motives remained. Patterns, after all, could repeat, and while this particular first-footing deception had been resolved, the instinct for control, the fascination with influence and hidden designs, was something that could always reappear in another form, in another place, in another mind. Hamish allowed himself a small, wry smile, sipping the now-cooling tea he had carried in his flask. "It is never as simple as it seems," he murmured to Jamie, who had joined him at the edge of the harbour. "The clues are always there, waiting for the right eye to notice. And until that happens, someone will always believe they are invisible." The snow shimmered under the late winter sun, the village returning to its ordinary rhythms, yet Hamish knew that vigilance, patience, and observation were the only certainties in Loch. Justice had been served, but the shadow of cunning remained, a reminder that even the most meticulous plans could only be revealed through careful, persistent scrutiny. Hamish walked slowly back along the frozen loch, the crisp air biting at his cheeks, the village behind him quiet now as if it too were catching its breath after the storm of revelations. The villagers moved cautiously through the snow, eyes still glancing toward the station, whispering in small clusters about the capture of Callum Fraser and the unmasking of Mrs. Gallagher's obsessive manipulations. On the surface, the case was closed, the criminals accounted for, the evidence carefully filed, and the village's fragile sense of security restored. Yet Hamish felt the familiar tug of unease, the way an unanswered question can linger like frost in the corners of a warm room. As he passed the harbour, his gaze fell on the edge of the frozen water where the last marks of the boathouse struggle had been made. The indentation he had noticed during the final confrontation, the subtle sign of someone crouching, watching, and then withdrawing it, still seemed oddly deliberate, almost like a signature. He crouched and traced the faint impressions with his gloved fingers, realizing that the alignment of the footprints and their timing didn't perfectly match Callum's presence, nor did it entirely align with the path Mrs. Gallagher had taken during her confession. A whisper of doubt formed. Had someone else been watching all along? Someone who had ensured the patterns, the distractions, and the misdirections? Hamish straightened and looked toward the village, noting the soft glimmer of lights through frosted windows. Morag and Angus had returned to their routines, grateful and relieved. Yet he remembered small details: Morag's fleeting glance toward the station that morning, the way Angus had unconsciously folded and refolded the corner of his coat, as if hiding a thought. Innocent habits, perhaps, but in Loch, nothing escaped notice for long. Somewhere in the quiet, there could still be a puzzle waiting, subtle but vital, a thread to be traced in another season, another winter. He allowed himself a faint, wry smile. The beauty of the work lay not in finality, but in observation skill of noticing what others dismissed. Patterns emerged, and even when the main actors had been accounted for, the margin for mystery persisted, teasing the imagination, testing intuition. Hamish had solved the first-footing deception, exposed the obsessive manipulation, and revealed the hidden hand behind it. Yet he knew that true insight was a perpetual vigilance. The village, peaceful as it seemed, contained small secrets, habits and intentions that would only become evident to the patient eye. As he continued along the loch, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow, he thought of the silk thread with the slight irregularity, the charred wool fragment that had vanished before it could speak fully, and the tiny glimmer of gold that had hinted at someone else's subtle presence. These details were minor, almost imperceptible, yet they reminded him that deception, like winter frost, could return silently, reshaping the familiar landscape. He could not ignore them, nor could he forget that even in resolution, vigilance was necessary. Reaching the edge of the village, Hamish paused and gazed across the low hills, where shadows stretched and melted into the horizon. The quiet was deceptive. The first-footing deception had ended, the villains exposed, and justice delivered but the faintest disturbances in patterns, the smallest overlooked gestures, the slight anomalies in behaviour, hinted at mysteries yet to unfold. Lochstub was serene for now, but the village had a way of keeping secrets until the right eye noticed them. With a final, thoughtful breath, Hamish tucked his hands into his coat pockets and turned toward the rising sun, the snow glinting like scattered diamonds across the frozen ground. There was a story behind every footprint, a hidden truth beneath every hearth, a shadow still waiting at the edge of perception, and for Hamish Macbeth, the work would never truly end. The village would always whisper, and he would always listen, ready for the next puzzle to emerge, patient and vigilant, as mysteries in Lockdub never fully sleep.